Hey everyone. In this science lesson, we're going to start talking about the way we classify living things into different categories. So there are a whole bunch of ways that we can do it. We're just going to look at we're going to kind of zero in on one way that living things are classified, and in the future we'll take a look in another one or two videos. We'll examine this in greater detail. So this is part one of maybe two, maybe three. We'll see. But yeah, so let's jump right in. So the first thing that we need to sort of understand is the hierarchy of biological classification. That's a fancy way of saying we need to look at sort of the order in which we describe things. Um, but the hierarchy meaning that some of these levels are higher than others when we're classifying organisms. So the way this works is I've written out the levels on this slide with the broadest description of some type of organism uh, being at the top, and the most specific version of the most specific way to describe that organism down at the bottom. So if we just go through this list, you don't have to remember all of these words right now, but it might be something that I could just ask you on a test that to write these down in order or something. So just try and get a little familiar with the names. So as we go from the top, we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. I have included subphylum right here, but in my science classes we never really talk about that so much when we're going through this order. So I've put it there in case you find like a science book or something in your house that does talk about it, but generally this thing isn't something that I tend to see a lot of. So the way this works is you start out with all living things uh, on the planet that need to be classified. And so some of them fall into these really, really big categories called kingdoms. So that's where this whole thing sort of starts, is if you're trying to figure out how to classify an organism, the first thing you need to do is decide what kingdom it's a part of. So there are a few different kingdoms, and that's what we're going to be looking at in the rest of today's video. But basically the way that this hierarchy works is picture that you've got like a container. So picture you've got like a container like this. Um, and then you've got a whole bunch of these containers, a whole bunch of these really big containers, and each container is a kingdom. So each one of these is like a box that you can put your different organisms into to classify them. So you've got a whole bunch of different kingdoms. This would extend onwards, off the page in that direction. And we're going to have a whole bunch of huge, huge kingdoms. And then inside that kingdom, you'll have a whole bunch of different phyla. That's phylum plural is P-H-Y-L-A, phyla, P-H-Y-L-A, right there, phyla. That's plural. Um, So basically within each kingdom you'll have, so you have that big container which is the kingdom, and then inside of it you'll have smaller containers. So you'd have a smaller container or a few smaller containers for the different phyla. So one container for each phylum that you have. So maybe there's one phylum and then there's another phylum. And then inside each one of those you move down the next level over here. So after a phylum you have a class. So then within each phylum you have a class, or rather you have a whole bunch of different classes. So you could have a whole bunch of different classes in here, and then within the class you'd have an order. So if we just keep going down this list, within that class you'd have an order, so there'd be a whole bunch more of these little guys in here, and then within each order you have a family. So really tiny ones down here, and then you'd have a genus, so even smaller. And then lastly you would get to the species, and so that would tell you exactly what species this organism is, and all organisms of the same species, they'll all share a bunch of different characteristics. And those characteristics could be things like how they get their food, or can they move or not? What are they made out of? Like, what are their cells made out of? What's their reproductive cycle like? What's their life cycle like? All those kinds of properties would be the same for organisms of the same species. But basically, the way this hierarchy works is it just gets, as you go down this list, the classification of the organism becomes a lot more specific. So it starts off as being really vague. So like this big container is the kingdom, and so all of the organisms in the kingdom share a couple things in common, but not necessarily a ton of stuff in common. Then as you go further down, here's your phylum, and it'll have more things in common. So you'll have, within your kingdom, you'll have a phylum that's got one property, one trait, and then a different phylum that's got a different property or a different trait. So that would be like this phylum over here versus this phylum over here will have some different traits, but they still have some things in common because they're part of the same kingdom. And then that idea just keeps going down this whole list. So you'll have, within a phylum, you'll have classes, so the organisms have even more in common there with other organisms in the same class, but then there are also different classes that will still have some things in common because they're part of the same phylum and they're part of the same kingdom, but they've got some differences, which is why they have a different class. So for organisms that are really, really similar, chances are they're in the same kingdom, they're in the same phylum, they're in the same class, they're in the same order, and then, the more of these things that you can sort of check off as, yep, same kingdom, same phylum, all the way down to like same family or same genus, then you can say that those organisms are probably really similar, maybe from an evolutionary standpoint, or they just have a lot of different traits in common. So we're able to classify them in really, really similar ways, where they only start to differ sort of down here in these last couple of steps or last few steps. But then you'll have organisms that are completely different. So you'd have like a bear versus a mushroom versus a tree will all fall into different kingdoms because they're all so different from each other that they don't even fit into a single kingdom. So you have to put them into a bunch of different kingdoms. So now, for the rest of this lesson, when we're looking at just the way we classify different organisms, for the rest of this lesson, we're just looking at the different kingdoms that we can use to classify different organisms. So when I was in school, we studied 5 kingdoms of living things, and they are listed on the screen there. A lot of the time, if you go and do some research on this, you'll see that their names are written in Latin. So that's why I've got that there in brackets. Note that one of them is exactly the same, and the rest of them are pretty much the same. But so basically, in English, the 5 major kingdoms are animals, plants, fungi, protists, and monerans. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of the different kingdoms. But before we do that, I want to give you guys a little bit of a heads up. So the heads up is that you may see this alternative. Some scientists came up with this as an alternative way to classify organisms back in the late 90s. And so instead of having 5 kingdoms, they have 6. And you'll see that instead of protists, that name just disappears completely. And instead we've got these 2 names instead. So basically they subdivided one of the kingdoms from what we saw just before into these 2 new ones that they can sort of separate. And instead of calling them Monerans, they now just call them bacteria. So they've changed a couple of the names, but the overall idea is the same as what we had with the containers and stuff a couple slides back. But yeah, this is something that you might see. This is something that's a little bit newer. The 5 kingdom model is from, I think, 1969. But it's one that's used widely around the world. I think in the US and Canada they tend to use 6 kingdoms, so you'll see this kind of thing if you're looking in Canadian or American schools. A lot of them now show 6 kingdoms, but I could be wrong about that. Um, but the books that I studied this stuff from are from England and India, where they used 5, or at least they used 5 at the time when these books were written. They're not that old, they're not like from the 60s or something, but the 5 kingdom model is just more popular in other parts of the world. Now, beyond the 5 kingdom model and the 6 kingdom model, there's also one that was developed fairly recently, just a few years ago, and this is 7 kingdoms. So again, you can see that we've got these same 2 new ones that we saw in the last slide. Monerans still renamed to bacteria, but now we've got this last new one, archaea, and this collectively, basically, right in here, is the Monerans. So the Monerans from the 5 kingdom model. So it's the same overall idea once again. They've just subdivided the kingdoms into, well, not really subdivided. They've divided the kingdoms into more kingdoms. So they're all of these in this model are still kingdoms. It's not like some of these are kingdoms and some of these are phyla. They're all kingdoms here. And that's another way that you could classify organisms. And if that wasn't confusing enough, this is an older model than the 7 kingdom one and the 6 kingdom one, but there are some places out there that you might see 8 different kingdoms. So here, I think, if I'm doing this right, these 3 make up what we called the Protists in the 5 kingdom model. So these are all our Protists. I'm just going to put a P because it's really hard to write with my touchpad here. But then these 2 down here, we've got slightly different names now. Instead of bacteria and archaea, we've got these different names, eubacteria and archaebacteria. And these make up the Monerans that we had in the 5 kingdom model. So I'm not going to be talking about the 6, 7, and 8 ones. I'm going to be talking about the 5 that I studied. It is still popular, so it's not like it's necessarily an outdated model, but it's good to know that there are some of these other models out there that that you should also be somewhat familiar with. So let's begin with the animal kingdom. This is the first of the 5 that we're going to be discussing. So here are a few things that define the animal kingdom. Basically, these are the things that make animals animals. So one of the big things is that they are multicellular organisms. So for those of you who did science class with me a couple of years ago, our biology unit was spent sort of studying the cell by itself. And so one of the things that we tend to see in the animal kingdom is that the different organisms are multicellular. They're made up of many different cells. Now that's not to say that they're all big, made up of millions or billions of cells or anything like that. But if it's made up of more than one cell, it has to be multicellular. So they can be small, they can be microscopic, they can be really hard to see. They can be quite simple in some ways, but one of the defining characteristics is that they're multicellular organisms. Now, the second term, they are eukaryotic. And so what that means is that the cells, so if I draw a little picture of a cell up here, so it's not going to be a super detailed thing, but we'll have things like the Golgi apparatus, and we'll have the endoplasmic reticulum and all of that stuff in here. We'll have some ribosomes, we'll have some vacuoles, etc., all in this cell. And then we've got a whole bunch of different things in this cell. Here's your endoplasmic reticulum, just a little rough drawing of what that might look like. The thing that makes a cell eukaryotic is that the nucleus of the cell, so that's like this thing in here, the nucleus needs to be enclosed within a special membrane, a nuclear membrane. So it basically gets a little envelope to itself, that keeps it separate from the rest of the cell. So basically, the genetic material of the cell is um, is hidden away from the rest of the cell by this nuclear membrane. So basically, you have the nucleus in there, you've got all the genetic material, and then you've got this nuclear membrane around it that separates it from the rest of the cell. And that's what makes this a eukaryotic cell. So all animals are made up of eukaryotic cells. The other type is prokaryotic cells, where we don't, where the nucleus doesn't have that protective casing to it, and we'll see that a bit later on. But yeah, so that's one of the other important characteristics for animals. Now the next one is that they must consume other organisms, so some form of organic material, to gain their energy. And so this could be something that you've discussed before in great detail. Basically, the idea is you as long as your animal is consuming something, then it's not producing its own energy, right? It's if it's not basically making its energy from like sunlight or something, then it fits this criterion of consuming other organisms to gain energy. So there are a few different ways that they can go about it. You can have herbivores, which consume exclusively plants. You can have carnivores, which exclusively consume animals, other meat, and then you can have omnivores, which are a balance between the two. So there are a bunch of different ways that animals choose to go about gaining their energy. A lot of them just feed off, fruits and plants and things like that, and then other ones will chase down their meals because their meals are other animals that can run away. Um, in general, animals tend to breathe oxygen. So if you want the fancy term for that, that's aerobic respiration. Respiration means breathing, and aerobic means that it needs oxygen. It has something to do with oxygen. So if you ever read about something that's an aerobic process, then that means that oxygen is involved in some way. So with animals, they generally make use of aerobic respiration, which means that they breathe oxygen. And there are a whole bunch of different kinds of animals, and I've listed down some examples at the bottom of the slide here. So we've got mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, worms, insects, arthropods, and more. So arthropods, things like spiders and such. All of those different things fit into the animal kingdom. There are lots and lots and lots of different things that fit into the animal kingdom. So the next one is plants. Similar to animals, we've got multicellular organisms. I'm going to do this slide in green because plants. So they're multicellular, so same deal as before. The one sort of difference is, which we'll get down, we'll look at the details of it here, is that the cells of plants are different from the cells of animals. But we're going to talk about that in a little while. So same requirement as for plants is that same requirement for plants as we saw for animals, which is that they are also eukaryotic. So same deal with the nucleus being protected by a nuclear membrane, by some sort of enclosed space. Now, one difference between plants and animals is that in general, plants will produce most of their own energy through photosynthesis. So this is something that animals can't do. And that's one huge advantage that plants have, is that they don't need to move around to gain their energy. They just need to be in a place where the sunlight can reach them. So photosynthesis is basically a special process that plants are able to carry out, where they make use of carbon dioxide from the air, water, and sunlight, the energy from the sun, to create sugars that then they can use for their functions, for their different functions. So plants are able to basically make their own food through this process, and this is why they need to have cells that are built differently and have different functions, as in this fourth point right here. And the reason for that is that animal cells don't really have a way to photosynthesize. So plant cells need to come up with a way to do that. And one other difference with plant cells is that their cell walls, firstly, animal cells don't have cell walls, they have cell membranes. Plant cells have cell membranes, but they also have cell walls which contain cellulose. I'm going to write that down over here. I should not have done this in cursive, but we're going to make it work. Cellulose. And this helps to give the cells some strength, and it helps with the structure of the plant, with holding up the plant, basically. So within the plant, you'll have your cell wall and your cell membrane. Whoops, that went outside the diagram, but you get the idea. And then inside, they've still got their large central vacuole and things like that we've studied in years gone by. They've got a whole bunch of the same things that we see in animal cells, and also when it comes to their nucleus, it's enclosed in a nuclear membrane because they're eukaryotic. But in addition to all of the other stuff that plant cells have that are in common with animal cells, they also have chloroplasts, and chloroplasts are what allow plant cells to carry out photosynthesis. So that basically these little parts of the cell here, these chloroplasts, they contain chlorophyll, which allows the plants to make use of that sun's energy by absorbing it directly and then converting it into sugars. So that's the job of that particular organelle, and that's one key difference between plant cells and animal cells, aside from the cell wall stuff. Now, again, there are lots and lots of different kinds of plants. A lot of the time we see them, in our daily lives. The green color that we see comes from the chlorophyll, and so that covers a whole bunch of different types of plants, but we've got some examples here. We've got flowering plants, we've got mosses, we've got trees, algae, ferns, and the list goes on. There are some other organisms that you could find listed there. If you go on the Wikipedia page for plants, it's got a whole bunch of other things listed there, but here are just a few sort of broad examples of different types of plants. So the third category that we're talking about, the third kingdom that we're talking about, is fungi. And while you will see a lot of fungi that are multicellular, that's not really the defining feature of fungi. However, they are still eukaryotic, which again isn't any different from plants and animals, but it's the same idea as before, with the way that their cells are structured with regards to the nucleus. But the defining feature of fungi is that their cell walls contain chitin, which, just the way that plant cells have cellulose for their own structural benefit, fungi have chitin for their own structural benefit. So this is something that's found in the exoskeletons of some invertebrate organisms, which we'll study a little bit later on. In the next lesson, we'll talk about vertebrates and invertebrates. But so it's something that has been seen in other organisms, but the way that fungi use it, this is their defining feature. What makes something a fungus? Fungus is singular, the singular of fungi. This is plural. The defining feature is this chitin, the presence of chitin in the cell walls. Now with fungi, just like plants, they generally cannot move. So that's what I mean here with that they're immobile. They can't move around to get their food, but they also have the problem of not having any chlorophyll. So they've got the negative side of animals, which is that they can't photosynthesize, which is that they can't make their own food. And they've got the negative side of plants, which means that they in the sense that they can't move. So it's a bit of a problem if you can't chase down your food, but also can't make your own food. So that's why you'll see a lot of fungi that are able to just consume dead stuff that's around them, stuff in the soil, that they'll just dissolve by releasing chemicals, and then they'll absorb that dissolved mixture from the ground. So there are a whole bunch of different fungi that clearly, if they're still here, then their system works. But it's definitely a different way to go about gaining your energy than the way plants do it and the way animals do it. There are a whole bunch of different types of fungi. A lot of people, when they hear fungus, if they're not thinking of some sort of infection, then they're thinking about mushrooms. In my experience, that's what a lot of people tend to think of first, and it's what I tend to think of first. If somebody says fungi, I immediately picture a mushroom, so that's their first example here, but there are a whole bunch of different ones. The fourth kingdom is the Protists, and this one is a little bit hard to write about. Uh, they've got some characteristics that are the same as uh, as the other organisms. So we've got that they're eukaryotic still, so their cell nuclei are protected by a nuclear membrane. Um, However, one difference from what we've seen, particularly with animals and plants, is that protists are generally single-celled, so they're unicellular organisms. So basically, it's one cell, and its nucleus is protected by a nuclear membrane. So its nucleus will be in here, in purple, and the nuclear membrane is the red, let's say. But that's it. That's the whole organism. They're generally thought, when you look at a whole bunch of different types of protists, you'll see that they're pretty primitive compared to some of the plants and animals and stuff that we see today, because not all protists are particularly complex organisms. Um, but it's kind of hard to describe protists as a whole, because this kingdom is basically the kingdom of oddballs or misfits or something, the organisms that didn't fit into the other kingdoms very cleanly. So they might have some characteristics that are in common uh, with plants or animals or something, but then they have too many other qualities that aren't the same. That means that they don't fit into the same kingdom. So uh, the the reason that it's hard to describe protists as a whole is that because it's just this mixed bag of oddballs that don't fit into the other kingdoms, you get a huge variety for the different types of things that you see when you study protists. So you might actually find protists that are really, really similar to animals and protists that are really, really similar to plants, and they're actually not like each other at all. So you might have organisms in the case of protists that they fit into the same kingdom, even though they're more similar to organisms from a different kingdom than they are to other organisms of their own kingdom. So it's a little bit of a weird setup. It's a little bit of a weird system um, in that regard, but it seems to work. But now, when you see that this is what the protists are classified as, this kind of makes sense why, when you look at the six kingdom model and the seven kingdom model and the eight kingdom model, why the protist kingdom was the first to disappear. And they started renaming it and breaking it down into two or three different chunks, is because this one is kind of really vague. Um, but for our purposes, especially since my biology skills are not so strong that we're going to be doing an in-depth study in this unit, this is hopefully a good enough introduction to the major kingdoms. So I just stuck with the five that I learned, and there are some examples listed at the bottom here. Amoebas, paramecia, etc. are different types of protists that you might see. Now the fifth kingdom is Monerans. And these are unicellular organisms, so they are single-celled. Just one cell is the entire organism. And finally, after going through all four of the other kingdoms, we have finally reached a kingdom that's not made up of eukaryotic cells. So this is sort of the defining feature of Monerans, is that they are prokaryotic. So basically you'll have one cell uh, by itself. Well, it's got to be one cell because of this first line. But within that, the different strands of genetic material, so the DNA and stuff, just kind of float around freely in the cell. So they aren't enclosed in some sort of membrane or envelope or anything. They just kind of hang around in the middle of the cell along with everything else in the cell. You might find in the single-celled organisms, you might find some that have like a tail, that have a little bit of a tail that they can use to propel themselves through through water or something, because they still need ways to get energy, and if they're just floating around completely at the mercy of an ocean current or something, then they might struggle to be able to get the energy that they need. There's a whole variety of different Monerans. Some of them can photosynthesize just like plants, but they don't qualify as plants because, well, they're unicellular, but also they're prokaryotic. So those are two big differences between Monerans and plants, which is why even though that some plants, even though some Monerans can photosynthesize, because they fail in that multicellularity that's needed for plants, and they don't have eukaryotic cells, they don't fit into that kingdom. Now, being unicellular, they don't have like a giant mouth. It's not like you've got, like a Moneran that's just got like this big gaping mouth it's trying to eat whatever's flowing into its path. Firstly, you don't know what's coming in, and secondly, you don't want the stuff that's inside to be getting out. So they do have to absorb their food in different ways. It's not like they're animals that are able to consume their food with some sort of mouth type orifice. But that's why some of the Monerans get pretty creative with things like the photosynthesis and stuff. So they have different ways of absorbing their food, and there are lots and lots and lots of different species of Monerans. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a little bit of an example of just how many different things there are that fit into that just gives some context to the different kingdoms that we're talking about here. There are lots of examples of Monerans. I've only included one here because when I was doing some quick research, a lot of them just have really complicated technical scientific names, because the official names for a lot of organisms are basically the Latin names of their classification with the kingdom phylum stuff. So their names end up being these really long Latin things. They chop off basically everything before family or genus or something, but you still end up with like a couple of really long Latin words. So it doesn't really help if I write down, like a 15-letter long thing that's in Latin and call it, yeah, it's this type of bacterium. That doesn't really help you. The reason I've included this one here is because it's not the most complicated name. We've got bacteria, we know what that is, and we've got cyan, C-Y-A-N, right here. And that's because these are also known as blue-green algae, and they are photosynthetic. They're capable of using the sun's energy to create their own food, and they are thought to be one of the key reasons why our present-day atmosphere is filled with oxygen. The planet billions of years in the past didn't have any oxygen in the atmosphere. At some point, cyanobacteria came into existence, and they changed everything. They changed the composition of the atmosphere and stuff. So that's why I've included them. They're a bit of a cool example for that. So here's this little tree of life, you could say. I say little, it's not really that little. So all the eukaryotes, if you look at this, all the eukaryotes fit into this brown branch. So everything after this, all of those are eukaryotic organisms. So when you break them off into different classifications, all of the animals, even though it's an entire kingdom, they only take up one little branch at the end of this. All the fungi only take up one branch here. All the plants take up one here. Now we know protists are eukaryotic, so they also have to be past this branch. But the bacteria, and whichever classification system you're using, maybe you're talking about Monerans or eubacteria and archaeobacteria, or archaea and bacteria in the 7 kingdom model. It gets really messy when we're trying to look at these two on the left here, because there are so many different ways to classify them. But there are so many different things here in this blue branch and in this red branch that hopefully give you some sense of scale for just how many different things there are in the microscopic world. When it comes to the protists and the bacteria, the really small things that we generally can't see, but they take up almost all of this tree of life. Here's our friends, the cyanobacteria that we just talked about a second ago. But yeah, the 3 big kingdoms that those are the only ones that we tend to see, the animals, the plants, the fungi. They are just this little section of this entire tree of life. Everything else doesn't fit into those 3 kingdoms. Now, last but not least, this is something that I'm going to leave as something for you guys to do a little bit of reading on your own. Perhaps it's something that we can talk about in one of our Friday Zoom calls or something. Viruses. This is something that's perhaps a little bit too relevant this year, but there's not really a consensus between scientists about whether viruses are actually living things or whether they're not. So I'm not going to say more about that. That's something I want you guys to do a little bit of reading on your own, just to get you guys doing something beyond these lessons. So I want you guys to do a little bit of just a quick Google search, even if you're just looking on the Wikipedia page or something, that's fine. Figure out what viruses are, why is there this lack of consensus, lack of agreement between scientists about whether they're living things or not, and if they're not living things, how is it that they're causing such problems for humanity, or for living things in general? How can something non-living cause this much of an issue to things that are living, as we see from viruses present and past? So that's it for this lesson. That's just a little something that you guys can look at on your own outside of this. Next time we will be discussing more things relating to the classification of living things, but we're going to kind of zero into the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom before we move on to something else. So if you don't have any questions, I will see you in the next video. Have a good one.